A look outside the Beltway at Pittsburgh. The president said he's looking out for residents of the former steel town in pulling out of the Paris climate deal. International leaders, business executives, and people around the world are still reacting to President Trump's decision this week. In a few minutes, we'll talk with former Vice President Al Gore, a leading advocate on climate change. But joining me now is Scott Pruitt, Mr. Trump's administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency and a key player in the president's decision. Mr. Pruitt, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Good morning, Chris.
I want to start with a question that you were asked repeatedly on Friday. Here it is.
Yes or no, does the president believe that climate change is real and a threat to the United States?
Does the president believe today that climate change is a hoax?
What's interesting about all the discussions we had through the last several weeks have been focused on one singular issue. Is Paris good or not for this country?
Let me get this straight. You and the president spent weeks discussing whether he should pull out of the Paris climate deal, and you never discussed climate change?
It was about the merits and demerits of the deal, Chris.
But
so
part
that's
of that is
absolutely the
climate
focus. That's
change.
absolutely the focus. Look, when you look at what this country has achieved since the late 1990s, 2000 time frame, we've seen an 18% reduction in our CO2 footprint from 2000 to 2014. We're at pre-1994 levels. You know, what's interesting about all this criticism from the left, the environmental left, is if you go back to the time that the Paris deal was cut, those same groups, in fact, James Hansen, former national scientist, called it a fake and a fraud. The general counsel of the Sierra Club was critical of what was achieved in Paris because it didn't hold China, it did not hold India accountable, and the United States agreed to 26 to 28% reductions
we're going to get
in its GHG. But that's been the focus.
Sir, we're going to get into all of that, but what I'm asking you is, as the president's EPA administrator, as his point person on the environment, isn't that a conversation that over the last few months you have to have, whether or not climate change is real or a hoax, as the president suggested, and whether or not human activity contributes to it? Are you saying you've never had that conversation with him?
The focus of the last several weeks was centered on the merits and demerits of the Paris Agreement.
Have you ever had a conversation on climate change?
The president said actually back during the campaign that climate change occurs. I said during my confirmation process that climate change is occurring, that human activity contributes to it.
He's also said it was a hoax.
Well, Chris, the point here, and to your question, this is something over the last several weeks. The president has received much information about the impact on jobs and also the impact on the environment. You know, we have nothing to be apologetic about as a country with respect to what we've done in reducing our CO2 footprint.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but you're not going to tell me whether or not the president believes climate change is a hoax and whether or not human activity. It's a simple question.
The president has indicated that climate changes. It's always changing. I've indicated the same.
Well, that's just saying
what's important, Chris, here, what's important is what the president did on Thursday was put America first and say to the United States and say to the world that we're going to remain engaged, but we're also going to make sure that as we remain engaged, we put America's interests first.
As you pointed out, the president justified pulling out of the Paris deal largely on economic terms. Here he is.
The American family will suffer the consequences in the form of lost jobs and a very diminished quality of life.
But the study that the president cited was funded by two groups that are dramatically opposed to environmental regulation, and the study itself acknowledges it does, this is a quote from the study, it does not take into account potential benefits from avoided emissions. The study results are not a benefit-cost analysis of climate change.
Well, there were several.
Administrator, it is a worst-case scenario.
There's several studies that were actually published in response to Paris. NERA, the Heritage Study, the Global Policy Publication.
He specifically quoted NERA.
There were several that were sourced aspects as far as his speech. And what we know from the Paris Agreement, objectively, is that it was a $2.5 trillion contraction to our economy over 10 years. What we do know is it impacted up to 400,000 jobs in this country. What we do know is it impacted both the manufacturing base and energy sector jobs. You know, since the fourth quarter of 2016, Chris, we've had almost 50,000 jobs created in the mining and coal sector alone. In fact, in the month of May, almost 7,000 jobs. So these individuals that are saying, and I think what's also being missed here is that when you look at how we generate electricity in this country, the power grid, we need fuel diversity. We need coal, natural gas, hydro, renewables, nuclear as part of that mix because it provides stability and strength to our grid and lower costs. Our price per kilowatt compared to Germany, our price per kilowatt compared to Europe is far better, and it helps us grow jobs in this country.
But Mr. Pruitt, aren't you focusing on the wrong thing? I want to put up some, I must say, surprising statistics. Take a look at this. The U.S. now employs more than double the number of people in the solar industry that it does in coal. Aren't you and the president talking about protecting the horse and buggy business just as cars come online?
Absolutely not, because as I just indicated, we need coal, we need solid hydrocarbons stored on site at utility companies across this country to address something, a tax on our grid, a tax on infrastructure. If we have peak demand needs, you want a diversity of fuels that generate electricity. It is bad business. It is bad business for a country to limit the
president talks about protecting the people of Pittsburgh. The mayor of Pittsburgh said, we're not a steel town anymore. We're a green town. And in fact, he rejected what the president said. And the mayor of Pittsburgh, the city he specifically cited, said, we're going to comply with the Paris Climate Accord.
This president has said we truly need an all-of-the-above approach. We should not penalize sectors of our economy, Chris. Government regulation shouldn't be used to pick winners and losers. The past administration declared a war on coal, and there were several coal facilities across this country shut down because of their past efforts. That is not what government regulation should be about. Government regulation should be about making things regular, not picking winners and losers, and making sure we have fuel diversity in generating electricity in this country. And as I indicated, the jobs numbers show already that this president's deregulatory agenda, his leadership in the energy space, is making a difference for jobs across this country. Almost 50,000 in the coal sector.
I want to go to another issue, because the president also said that the Paris Climate Accord and pulling out of it isn't going to make all that much difference on the environment. Here he is.
With total compliance from all nations, it is estimated it would only produce a 0.2 of 1 degree. Think of that. This much.
But the people behind the MIT study, that study that he just cited, say that he took a number from 2014 before the targets for the Paris Accord were even reached. And the co-founder of the program said this about the White House. They found a number that made the point they want to make. It's kind of a debate trick. The people behind the study the president cited say, look, Paris isn't going to solve everything. It isn't going to solve global warming, but it makes an important contribution.
What short memories these folks have. What short memories they have. James Hansen, former NASA scientist, the father of climate change, he's been called Paris a fake and a fraud because of the very things the president cited. 0.2 of 1. There are other studies. The Global Policy publication came out criticizing.
Are you going to speak to what the MIT author said?
It's very fishy to me that the MIT updated their study or their results after we started citing it. No one's questioned the methodology.
Well,
nobody's questioned the findings.
You didn't cite their study after Paris. You cited their study before Paris in 2014.
And what's interesting, Chris, is during the time before Paris, this country reduced their CO2 footprint by over 18% from 2000 to 2014. What does that demonstrate? It demonstrates that American innovation, American technology is leading the way with respect to reducing the CO2 footprint, not government mandate. If China and India want to reduce their CO2 footprint, they should learn from us.
Well,
India, by the way, in the Paris Agreement, talking about the merits of the deal, Chris, conditioned any steps that they would take on receiving $2.5 trillion of aid. China agreed to take no steps until the year 2030.
But wait.
They're the largest polluters in the world.
Let me pick up on that, because you've taken me exactly where I wanted to go. This is working together. The president had one more big complaint about Paris, and he said that it treats the U.S. unfairly.
China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants. So we can't build the plants, but they can, according to this agreement. India will be allowed to double its coal production by 2020.
But here again, sir, the reality is different, is very different from what the president said. China has canceled plans for more than 100 coal plants and promises 20% of its energy consumption will be green by 2030. India has pledged 40% of its energy will be renewable by 2030 and is set to pass Japan this year as the world's third largest market for solar power. So it may not mandate it in the Paris Agreement, but in fact, China and India are going green already.
You know, what's interesting, one of the key words that was up on the screen was plants. China was actually building over 360 new coal generation facilities and had 800 planned, Chris. So maybe they've drawn back on the number that are planned, but they're burning coal, and they're going to continue to burn coal.
Well, we're burning
for the
coal.
foreseeable future. We've had a contraction with respect to our grid quite substantially. We used to be well above 40%. We're now down around 30%, if not less. So this country has front-loaded its cost. The rest of the world said, hey, we'll get to that later. They applauded when we joined Paris. The rest of the world applauded, not because of climate reductions, but because it put this country at an economic disadvantage. The Clean Power Plan alone represented almost $300 billion of compliance cost to our economy. So why wouldn't why wouldn't France and these other countries want us to stay in that kind of deal? It's a bad deal for this country. The president didn't say, by the way, that we weren't going to continue engagement. The president didn't. He said Paris represents a bad deal for this country.
He also said we're going to renegotiate, and all of the leaders around the world, certainly in Europe, said forget it.
Well, then he also said either a new deal or as part of the Paris Agreement. But we're already look, we're the United States, Chris. We don't lose our seat at the table. We joined a treaty in 1992 called the UNFCCC with respect to climate change. Right. And that is still there. We're going to remain engaged internationally, but we're going to make sure that as we make deals, that we put the interest of America first. This was applauded by small business. You know, it was interesting. The New York Times yesterday had an article of small business that applauded.
I don't want you to filibuster so we can't get to Al Gore. We want to get to him too. And you've brought up a lot of legitimate points I'm going to ask him about. Mr. Pruitt, thank you for your time. Always good to talk with you, and thank you for answering our questions.
Thanks, Chris.
That's what it's all about. Up next, former Vice President Al Gore on